just introduce everybody. In case you don't know, this is Neil Lorene, who is 445. Who is one of the managers at 445 Park Avenue. Daniela Schlisser, who is a very successful agent at 445 Park Avenue. Terry Naimi, who is also another successful agent, who now currently sits at 135th Avenue. So Mr. Charles Ruoff, who joins us from the Park Slope office, who's also a very successful agent. Welcome. And Miss Lisa Littman, who is in the Upper West Side office, who I'm sure everybody knows, also another. Let's not forget Mr. Gregory Heim, who's here to help us with Chief Economist. Everybody who's going to make a lot of jokes and make everybody laugh. So.
Some of them aren't such great jokes. Anyway, the subject is how to turn a difficult conversation into a positive result. The reason that we asked Greg sort of at the last minute to be the moderator is that the source of most of these difficult conversations is as a result of a challenging market that we are in. And so we thought no one better than who has information about that market.
Way to pass the buck and blame me at the same time.
Yeah, there you go. So, thank you. And,
enjoy, everybody. Thank you.
One of the things I don't like about this market is, we're in a market that is moving downward. We all pretty much accepted that by now, which means that so much of what we do in research becomes less useful, or useless, as a broker told me in a sales meeting once. When a market is changing, what happened 3 months ago is completely irrelevant to what's happening right now. And I know that may be one of the hardest conversations you have with yourselves. But I'm going to start with my good friend Lisa over here. So you have to deliver bad news very frequently, and especially in this market, whether that's, I guess, the open house attendance wasn't good, or the offers aren't coming, or the offer's too low. What strategies do you use when you have to give that seller, or even a buyer, although I don't think buyers get a lot of bad news these days, what is your strategy when you have to do it?
So, first of all, I want to say that my strategy is constantly changing because it's, I always tell people that the good news right now is that I feel like we sort of know where the market was. So I started feeling that the market was softening a couple, 2 or 3 years ago. For a long time it was kind of hard to deliver the message because it was slowly softening, yet there were no real indicators and there wasn't a lot of data showing that. We just had a lot of stagnancy. And until very recently, even the closed data didn't really show it because obviously a lot of the closed data has to do with new development. There's a lag time in closing. It was very hard to back up what you were feeling and then the message that you had to deliver, which was what was going on with somebody's apartment in real time. I guess the good news is that my strategy has been able to change now because I've been able to say to people, the data's in and the market's down 10 to 20%. Like that's just the way it is. So depending on where the property is and what price point it's at, it's down 10 to 20%. And we're starting to have data that shows it, and the media is starting to talk about it, and people are starting to talk about it. So I actually think that it's becoming easier to deliver that news than it was 6 months or a year ago. It was really hard back then. The toughest, I think my strategy, by the way, is to be honest, because nothing else is working these days, right? You can't sort of sugarcoat it. You can always have a silver lining, and you should always have a silver lining. If you're a good salesperson, you're always going to see the silver lining, and you're always going to have a positive outlook on the real estate market in New York. And if you can't have that, then you probably are going to have a hard time being a real estate broker in New York, or being a salesperson of any kind. What Greg said, and what's really true, is a lot of us, I don't think there's too many of us who've been in the business more than 20 years, but for at least 20 years, the stock market has always, the real estate market has always followed the stock market.
Not really.
In the last 20 years.
No, I mean, Hole yelled at me about this a couple of times. There are, a lot of times too, real estate is a good hedge against the stock market because it's a good inflation hedge. But we don't move in direct correlation because the stock market movements aren't always based on reality. And the biggest point that I try to make is we haven't had a housing correction in 9 years, right?
Yeah, but you
Things-
didn't let me finish.
But my point was, the stock market has had several mini corrections during that time. We haven't given back anything yet, but I'll let you finish.
Okay, so you're right, the stock market has had mini corrections, and the real estate market has had mini corrections. But it actually has. I mean, if you look at the real estate market, and basically since 1997, it's only gone up, except for 2008 and 2009. But I've been doing it and I track this stuff. Every year, even when it's gone up, we've had little peaks and valleys. We have them all throughout a year, and I know, because I remember this well, I got divorced in 2002, and I sold my apartment then, and there was a lull then. It was a low when I sold my apartment. So there have been ups and downs. I think if you track it as an economist, you don't see it as much, but in general, this is the first time in at least 20 years that the real estate market has not followed the stock market as a broad generalization. And that's what sellers don't understand. So I think you have to start a conversation with that this is different than it's been in the past. And then I think you have to tell people that the real estate market is down 10 to 20%. And then you have to give some good news. You have to give the news that if you price your apartment appropriately and you drop the price 10 to 20%, and sometimes it's 30%, and that just means that you were overpriced by 10% initially. I mean, really, there are apartments that are now selling for 30% less. You will sell it, and you'll get the price that it's worth, and things are selling, and we're still seeing bidding wars. And I know that on my listings, I have 4 different markets in the listings that I have. I have a market where I get no showings. I have a market where I get some showings and no repeat showings. I have a market where I get a bunch of showings, a bunch of repeat showings, but no bids. And then I have a market where I get bids. And for the first time in a really long time, I get bids below ask, way below ask. And they usually are coming in where the apartment is worth. And then I tell my sellers that they're lucky that they're getting offers, because at least people are stepping up to the plate. And there's a lot of apartments out there where no one's even offering anything, and nobody's even coming back for a second time. So what I think you have to do is you have to be honest, you have to be realistic with the seller about where the market is, price point. And then you have to stay positive and tell them that they will sell their apartment if they are willing to take 10 to 20% less of where the market was before. And I don't want to take up all the time, because I think a question you should ask somebody else is 10 to 20% off of what?
Okay, we'll get there. If you let us. Kill Lisa's mic. Daniela, so your seller is trusting you to sell, maybe not their most valuable asset, but a multi-million-dollar asset. How do you get them to trust you? And I'm sure that they don't think you're doing it for the wrong reasons, but how do you let them know that you're empathizing with them? You get their situation and you're there to help, not upset them further.
Well, the first thing I do that I think is super helpful in establishing that trusting an empathic relationship from the get-go is I always say we. I don't say you. I don't say I, but I don't say you are going to sell for a loss, or you are up against a difficult market, or you aren't getting any offers. I say we aren't getting any, we aren't getting offers. We need a different strategy. We're up against this. I help them I think that allows them to feel like I'm not isolating myself from their difficulty, but rather I'm going through it with them. Now, it's clear that the asset is theirs and the bigger hit is theirs, or rather the hit at all is theirs. But I think I have sensed strongly that, especially in this market, and I sense it in any market really, that just changing making that shift and putting the conversation into a teamwork, collaborative one elicits trust and a sense of support. So that's the first thing that I do, and I do that in any market, and I do that throughout. In this difficult market, I try to empathize with their difficulty. I think what a lot of people do that is hard on a seller is they distance themselves from every part of what a seller's going through. So if you jump in there and say, this is what we're up against, or this is what we need to do, or we need a different strategy, and you also acknowledge that I understand that, you know, you were hoping for this in order to do that, or I understand that it must be, you know, difficult to be, you know, I don't know, going by your empty nest, empty, you know, bedroom, or whatever it is that is motivating them to sell, and the market isn't making it easy for them. To identify it because you've heard them on why they need to sell, and you're really paying attention to acknowledge what it is that they're struggling with, what the impact of not being able to sell in the way that they would have wanted, either at the time they would have wanted or at the number that they would have wanted, how it's impacting them, I think helps them again to feel that you get it, you're empathizing, and it helps in my experience also for them to hear you when you're delivering the really crappy news of, you know, what they're going to have to do to make all that happen. So that, you know, you've expressed that you're in it with them, you're a team, you've identified why you understand that they are resistant to complying with the market. And having done that, I think it's an easier move to, but if we want to, and also I don't assume that they want to sell at all costs. So once I've done all that, I do say, that being said, all right, so now this is what we're up against, this is what you wanted, this is what's, you know, unfortunately the market isn't giving us. I do try and not take the blame. I do, you know, and to be honest, for the most part, it's not my fault. I haven't messed up on an asking price, I haven't failed to show, I haven't, you know, I haven't not accommodated requests, and I have marketed my face off. So it's not my fault. So but it's not their fault either. So I don't say.
I wish people would take that view of the market reports when they come out. And people don't like what they see, or the economy. They do it.
Yeah. So I think that, and then I ask them, what do you want? You know, I don't assume that they want to sell regardless, and I think the bottom line to all of that is I try to make them feel like we're in it as a team, and I'm listening, and I'm not here to, you know, bulldoze them. And then once they say, you know, and I say, do you want to sell regardless? This is what it will take to sell. Are you still a seller in this market? Do you want to wait out a better market? I don't tell them they must sell, because I think that also legitimately deflects from any trustworthiness, because if the market isn't giving them what they want or need, and I'm telling them they have to sell anyway, then I'm clearly in it more for myself than them. But I say, you know, you might want to ride it out. More often than not, they say they can't ride it out. They either want to upscale, downscale, move to Florida, whatever it is, and then I deliver the strategy. You know, having done, but I don't walk in and first deliver the strategy and say, you know, you're not getting your price and the market isn't there, and here's what you need to do. I go through all that so that there is, by the time we're talking about the massive hit they're going to have to take in order to get this sold, we're a team, and I'm hearing them.
Great. Now, I get a lot of calls from many of you about, you know, the problems that you face. Luckily, I'm on the other end of the phone. But Neil, you're there in the office. They're coming to you. How do you talk to the brokers before they talk to their sellers? And, you know, what do you? My problem is I get a lot of calls saying, when is this going to get better? You know, when, and you know, normally the easy answer is when the economy gets better. But the economy's a lot better than it's been in a while, and so that line doesn't work. But to me, the simple answer is it'll get better when sellers get desperate enough to cut prices. Usually a recession does that, but we don't have one of those, and we aren't going to have one. But what do you say to brokers coming with you with this frustration?
Well, first I'd like to say that I think Lisa's closed more deals than Greg, so I kind of agree with what she said. Using the term with our agents, microcycles, on a serious note, because I think you're seeing 3-week periods of activity, 2-week periods of stagnation. Some of those, depending on the product type and the geography, they will stretch a little bit longer than other microcycles. I also agree very much with Daniela that it's a partnership with your seller to the extent you can be empathetic. There does need to be some separation because you are a professional, so you don't want to be wrapped up in some of the emotional factors that motivate sellers to behave in one way or another. And I want to take it back, before we get right to the agents, I want to take it back and add one other layer to what Daniela had said. I think that the trust issue, eliciting trust from a seller, starts long before the difficult conversation begins, long before a number of days on the market with very little activity. I think it begins at the first point of contact, if not before, and some successful tactics that I've seen over the years. Number one, because we're talking about pricing and the truth, when you take a call, an incoming call from a potential seller, it's critical that you ask them to hold off on sharing their opinion of value for their apartment. Now, I don't know how many people do that, but it's like a gag order for your potential seller, because so many times we're biased and we're influenced by the number that they want. So I start that process by saying, listen, I want to come see the apartment. I take 2 visits. I want to see the apartment unless I've been there, in the last 3 months, and then we'll have a follow-up meeting that'll be more detailed in terms of evaluation, opinion on pricing, marketing strategy, and in the meantime, keep your opinion, hidden and private from me. So that certainly starts the process on the right foot, I think, if you take those steps. The other thing, and I might be criticized roundly for saying this, but it was very successful for me as an agent, I always suggested to the potential seller that he or she or they should meet with other agents, at least 2 other agents, gather some intel. Ideally, I'd like to come in last, but you didn't have a lot of control over that. That way they could see that some of the stuff that I was saying was either corroborated or very different, and I would have a chance to say, why it might be different in a follow-up call. So I think you start with a better platform of trust if you take some or all of those steps. As far as agents talking to sellers, the issue when I advise them is we go through the data. Very often there are a number of agents who come to my office, we run the comps, we see what the changes have been since this apartment went on the market. And I do think it would be inconceivable to attend a panel and not walk away with at least one fresh acronym. So I like this LIST acronym, which is the number of looks, how many visits to the web page. That's the L. The I is inquiries, email, phone calls. S is the showings, right? Requests to show. And T would be the true buyers. How many second visits? How many people asking for additional documentation? Do they ask for financials? They ask about sublet policy. So that information, again, factual, is the basis for the discussion with the seller. And very often, agents and I will call together. When agents come in, they might want a manager on the phone. And one of the things that we've been successful with is we ask the seller to describe their process when they bought it. What did they go through? Did they negotiate very aggressively? What were the market conditions when they bought it, right? So if they bought it in 2009 or 2010 or 11, maybe they faced similar conditions. So getting them to understand what the buyers are going through today is very helpful for them in digesting the truth of the market, which is that it's soft and bids are hard to find at elevated prices. So I think putting, the seller in the buyer's shoes is very helpful. Obviously, bringing a lot of data to the conversation, and the hope is that you're partnering with them and that you had established a good platform or foundation for trust at the outset.
Okay. Now I forgot to read this quote at the beginning. Sarah had given it to me, so since it involves data, I have to read it. It's from John Adams. Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. This is something I should have on my door. But, so Charlie, you have to have this conversation. You want to be prepared. I see you have notes, so you're prepared here, which is good. Now, the tools, in my opinion, the tools have changed. We just launched Resource, 2.0, and we have a set of analytics in there, market analytics, which I myself have said aren't very useful in most cases right now. And by the way, Lisa, there's economic data there, including the S&P 500, if you want to prove me wrong. But, now we are in a market that is chasing a bottom, and when you're doing that, again, appraisers have this problem, and you guys have this problem. How do you convince your seller that she is overpriced when you don't necessarily have data? We're throwing numbers out 10% down, 20% down. Well, at the risk of getting stoned up here, when we release our market report for the third quarter, it's not gonna look that way. Now, people have to remember what a market report is. And that is basically reporting on what sells. And what sells is appropriately priced. The correction is started at the high end, like Lisa said, but that means we're seeing more high-end closings. So overall, the market is not gonna look as unhealthy as a general thing. But again, that's why I say, before you send this report out or hand it to a seller, read it, know what's in it. Is it relevant? If the unemployment rate is 4% and you don't have a job, you're not really impressed by that number. So what are you looking for? Is it different in Brooklyn? Camille tells me everything is different in Brooklyn. But is it different in Brooklyn? No, I'm just kidding. But what tools do you have?
Well, first of all, to add to what Lisa and Neil both said, first of all, the market in Brooklyn started to soften later by a lot than Manhattan. So a lot of people out here in the Brooklyn market are saying, 10 or 20%? Where is that coming from? Because that hasn't been our experience. What's propelled the market or kept the market harder than I think it normally would is that we've had a lot of Manhattan brokers coming to Brooklyn, not knowing what things should be priced at, not wanting to spend a lot of time with their customers and saying, this is a really good deal. You know what this cost in Manhattan? And I actually think Manhattan buyers coming to Brooklyn without good representation last year and the year before overpaid. We did start to see, as Lisa said, 2 years ago, I noticed open house attendance down, cash down payments were down. People had a lot of enthusiasm, but as we were going through open houses, sometimes I have junior folks, help me out with open houses, and we look at feedback and go, wow, everybody's so excited. I said, yeah, but I don't think any of these people can buy. And where I would get 5 and 6 offers, I'm kind of known not to overprice. I think I've taken 5 price reductions in the last 5 years on all my properties total. And in the last year, I've taken 3 different properties, 3 price reductions. So clearly it's starting to impact the market. But Brooklyn has been a dichotomy. It's starting to get softer now. The data doesn't show it. I think you have to sort of step out of the box and say, okay, when you get a call to list, you get excited for a moment, right? Okay, I've been identified as someone that should be pitching this property. I know the building, I might know the seller, I've been referred to somebody who I know really well and have done a really good job for. But you have to look at a couple things. One is, and get on the phone, a lot of what you're doing with sellers and buyers, stop the text, stop the email, really get on the phone. Meet with them. Sometimes when you're having this, you have to have this conversation, oh, Charlie wants to meet with me, oh God, what is he gonna tell me? Well, you gotta change your price, But a lot of this comes down to meaningful discussion and empathy with your buyer. So with your seller. So a couple of things. One is talk to them in person, let them speak first. Decide what your objectives are going to be. Okay, what am I going to get out of this conversation? What do I hope to get out of the conversation? Obviously, you're hoping to sell the apartment. And then memorialize it in writing. So if you're going to take a listing and you're really not, they're pushing you on a price, but it's a beautiful apartment or a house, you really have a good relationship with this client or potential client, decide on a range. Okay, you want to go out on this within a certain period of time. In Brooklyn, we would say within 2 weeks or 3 weeks, max, take a price reduction. What Neil was saying, how does it appear on the web? How is your photography? Does your web listing, does it describe the place as it should be described? I see a lot of listings for $10 million apartments at Brown Harris Stevens and houses. The photography's horrible. I would never put something up like that. But look, change the web text, rotate the pictures, look at how many people have viewed the property. As Lisa said, second showings, dialogue. If it's a co-op, have they asked about financials? Have they asked about sublet? Are you having any conversations with brokers whatsoever? And the people that you trust who have seen the property, call them up and say, what do you think about this place? I think, people will give you as much as you give them. So if you have a good standing in the marketplace and people can trust you and they know that you deliver offers and you get on the phone with them and say to them, you're the third backup on this deal, but I want you to know you're still important to me. That's really important. So I think it's, but you have to document, you have to talk to your seller, you have to have empathy, and you also have to sit down with them. And sometimes it's, you know, you say, oh, I don't know if I really want to go to the apartment or the house to sit down with them, maybe they'll just have a cup of coffee, but you need to sit down and discuss, arrange, and then memorialize it in writing. Say, well, you know, we talked about this price, but it hasn't worked. But remember, we agreed in that email that we would do this, that, and the other thing? So I think that's very important. And you know, the new generation, you know, we do a lot of text and we do a lot of social media, but you really need data, you need empathy, you need to talk to your seller about what their objectives are. Hopefully.
Great. Now, Terry, I'm going to ask you the same question, but also, how do you tell a prospective seller that you don't want to take the listing in a way that's political, that you're not saying this thing's grossly overpriced and I don't want any part of it? Because obviously, more and more brokers are choosing to do that, not necessarily say it that way, but. So what kind of data do you come in, if you have to convince a prospective seller or a seller, and again, I want to remind people, because I think, you know, most of you are aware of most of the tools you have. We've talked about listing views, you know, you have analytics. The market activity report, I think, is maybe the key tool to use and resource right now. See what got listed this week, see what went into contract this week. You know, even though you don't know the prices on those units, the data shows that usually it's within 3 to 5% of the last asking price. Those apartments found buyers. What do those apartments have that yours doesn't, or your clients doesn't? So what do you look at, and if you have to have that conversation, either to tell a seller now, like, we should just take this off, or to tell a prospective seller that you don't want this listing, or it's not right for you.
Okay, well, I like to start from the beginning.
Okay.
When I first meet with them, I agree with what Charlie said, that it's really important to be face-to-face, right? Because you can email something, you can have a phone conversation, but they don't really see you, you don't see them, you don't see their reaction, and there could be misunderstandings, especially when you're telling people your place is not worth what they thought it was worth, right? So let's start at the beginning. So at the beginning, when I meet with them, I always ask what their goals are. What are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? Everybody sells for a reason, right? So some people have to sell, and if you don't know what their situation is, if it's a financial situation, they can't go out of the gate overpriced. That's it, they're dead. So once I find out what the reason is that they're selling, then I tell them about the market. And I tell them, do you know what's happening in the market? This is what's happening in the market for your particular property, for your kind of property. As you mentioned, the comps are not really relevant right now because what sold a few months ago, maybe went to contract 6 months ago, it's not gonna, the same sale's not gonna happen today. So then what I tell them is, let's look and see what's on the market that's comparable to yours. How long has it been on the market? How many price reductions have they had? Did these properties go to contract? So that kind of shows them what's happening in the market without me just saying, oh, it's not that great right now. So that's really helpful. So first I find out what their goals are. Then I tell them what the market looks like. Then we talk about a price. If they're unrealistic and they say, I want $10 million, and the place isn't worth $10 million, I do this thing which I learned from a very, very wise broker, and I don't remember who it was, but he told me he takes out a sheet of paper and draws this circle and says, inside this circle is the market. And if we price your place at 10 million or 5 million, or whatever it is, you're here outside the circle. So you're not in the market. If you want to be in the market, we can talk about what we need to price at to come here and make sure they feel comfortable. So if there's a lot of resistance to that, I suggest a pricing preview. We have other brokers come in, give their estimates, why they think the property should be priced as such, then I share that with them. If they're still thinking that it should be at that high price, then I suggest, especially in today's market, I suggest a quiet sale at the beginning, because that way you're not out of the gate at this price. And once it's out, it's out. It's all over the web, you can't pull it back, and you're kind of stuck.
Well, that's the stuff that the historical data will show you, that, you know, things that sell very close to asking price and still fairly quickly, you know, a little more than 3 months. Does an appraisal come into the conversation at all, or it usually doesn't go to that level?
For me, it doesn't go to that level, but people do say that, oh, I refinanced, and when I refinanced 2 years ago, my place was worth more than what I'm suggesting to you. So given that this is what the appraised value is, da, 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 da. And then I talked to them about how that's irrelevant because that wasn't in the market, and the way I think banks appraise, and I know we're in a bank, but I think the way that they appraise for a refi is very different than the way they appraise for an actual purchase. So again, to answer your question, I don't remember specifically what it was.
That's all right. No,
Okay.
no, when you get to the point where you have to tell that seller, like, look, you know, I can't list it at this price, or how do you do that and maintain the relationship and not, you know, tell them they're making a mistake to their face, so to speak?
Okay, well, so after all my efforts to get them in that market, which honestly, visually, it's really, really helpful for people to see that. They're like, oh, it's a circle. I'm not in the circle. I'm not in the market. I say you might as well not put your place up for sale, because if you're not in the market, it's not going to sell. And if they say we still want to try for this, and they're not willing to do what I suggest, which is the pricing preview, and then having it quietly listed, and I like them and I like the property, I say, you know what, I would love to work with you. I understand that this is what you want and you're not ready for that right now. So please, please think of me after you're not able to sell with the broker you work with now.
You phrase it like that?
Yes.
I thought I delivered news harshly.
No,
No, it's honesty. I should be able to appreciate that.
And sometimes, not always, but sometimes people go, no, I like you, I want to list with you. What do we need to do?
Right.
But when they see that you're walking away, it's almost like going to a Turkish bazaar and they're trying to sell you something and you're like, no, I'm not interested. They come back, it's the same thing.
Right.
If they think, oh my God, the broker is not, they're gonna lose this money, well obviously they're not gonna make this money. So then the realization hits them, I think, a little bit more, and I think that's helpful.
So, Lisa, obviously, you know, this is a referral business you're in, so like Terry said, you want to be known as an honest broker, and people will respect that. So, sometimes do you have to really give them a harsh dose of reality? I mean, when you go in there, let's say you want that price reduction. Do you have a specific number in mind or a range? How do you negotiate with your own seller, so to speak? And how I guess, contentious can it get as someone who doesn't get to have that experience? And Charlie doesn't know about it either, so.
So, you know, a lot of these questions, I mean, some answers are sort of black and white. My experience is that a lot of this stuff, it's not black and white. It's an organic process. It really depends on the relationship you have with the seller. It depends on who the seller is. It depends on their motivations to sell. You know, so what I always say is, and I think this speaks to what everybody else has said, is FaceTime's incredibly important. You can tell how somebody's going to absorb the information. You can tell how nervous or upset or pleased or displeased they are. I also think that if you show that you're willing to spend the time meeting with somebody face to face, they tend to trust you more, and they tend to take what you say more seriously because you've taken time out of your day to hopefully go and meet with them at their property when it's a good time for them. So I definitely do think that anytime you're going to have a tough conversation, as much as it's difficult, you should try to have it face to face. And you know, Daniela and I, who are good friends outside of the office, and we have another person in our office too, always say, like, the hardest part of this market really is that so many people want to meet with you at 7 o'clock at night to talk about why their apartment hasn't sold. And Daniela and I and this other person, also we have kids at home, and you know, you think to yourself, oh my God, all I want to do is go home and just relax, and now I have to go speak to this person who's not happy and have that hard conversation. So all I want to say to you is we're all going through this. It's a really difficult market, and part of what I think will sustain you is to talk to your colleagues and make jokes about it. And it's almost like a support group at this point, and you need to have that because it's really hard. And, you know, Deanna Corey, who's also a very successful broker, she and I have talked a lot, and, you know, she said to me the other day, it's true, she's been doing this longer than me, she said, you know, we all got really used to it being sort of easy. And I don't know that it's ever been an easy business, but we really have never had a market that's as sort of difficult as now. So in 2008, 2009, you kind of knew why everything was bad. Everybody knew. There was no, you know, there was no secret. There was no mystery as to what was going on. Now there's a lot of mystery. The stock market thing, you know, personally, I think it has a lot to do with people's emotions. I think one of the things I often say to people when I meet with somebody is that, and I don't like to bring politics into something because you never know what somebody's politics are, but you say that the fact that our government seems to be in disarray and that there's so much news about our own government makes people feel insecure and nervous. And, you know, I was just listening to something the other day about there was, you know, Obama has not really spoken out until recently because that wasn't his thing. And then they were talking about how Obama never really talked about the economy because he didn't want to take credit for it in case it went the other way. And that one of the reasons why the economy is so good is because Trump talks about the economy and takes credit for the economy, so people feel good about the economy. And what I try to explain to people when I speak to them is that we're this little island and we're always really different than the rest of the country, and we continue to be different right now also. So again, whether you're for our government, anti our government, Republican, Democrat, I think almost everybody on our little island kind of agrees that things don't feel so great in Washington. That may be different in other parts of the country, but it's not true here. And that is really hurting our real estate market. And I do think people understand that. So that's a conversation to have with somebody face to face, because if you just say it on the phone, it doesn't really mean that much. You have to say it and not be critical of what's going on with our government again, but just explain the fact that people feel confused and worried.
Well, I think too, you know, I hear a lot of people talk about the dysfunction in Washington, which by the way has been going on for 20 years. I think we all, and now we have a governor and a mayor who hate each other and can't be in the same room, although they took a nice shot the other day. I always remind people that, you know, the number one problem, obviously there's a lot for people to worry about. But remember, we had 9/11, we had a financial crisis, we had some storms that really knocked the region on their butts. To me, the number one thing to drive home is there is too much for sale. That's the easiest answer. I know it sounds like a cop-out, just like when I go to Lisa, why can't you, sell my apartment? She's gonna, it's overpriced. Okay, well, show me the data, we've talked about that. But Daniela, one of the things that I hear, and Lisa made a great comment in a sales meeting once, I won't use the exact language, but it was, she was talking about the frustration of a selling broker saying, well, my client paid this much for it 5 years ago and they want their money back. And she said, well, people aren't really so concerned about what your client paid for it. So is that the most, I don't say, common objection, or what are the objections you hear the most from the sellers? Is it, my home's great, my home's worth more, the view's better? What are the ones that you find it's harder than others to really counteract?
I don't know that there are some that are harder than others to counteract. I do think, though, that we can prepare ourselves for most of them. So what I see recur is what they paid for it, which these days is excruciating. But before I even meet with them, I try and get as much information into, what the last trade was, namely theirs, what the difference in condition was, because in theory I will know a bit from having spoken with them of, I did a renovation, whatever. So that, they get stuck on that, what they paid versus what the market's going to give them now. They get stuck on what they want to do with the money that in their mind the market should be paying for, which doesn't happen. Oh, well, I can't sell for that because what I want costs this. I would say those are the two that they get most stuck on because they're real numbers. And I think that's the piece of it also. I think the emotional stuff is easier somehow to work with. I think it gets dramatic, but it's easier to work with. But when you're telling people that whatever they invested, they will not get back, or whatever they want to purchase, they will not be able to pay for anymore, certainly not with this, that's really difficult, and they get very stuck. They're like, no, I don't want to let it go. I don't want to let it go at a loss, and I don't want to let that dream of buying the next level go by letting it go here.
Can I just jump in
No.
on one thing, please?
Yes, go ahead. See the clock there, you have 1 minute.
So in terms of, you said, well, I paid X, and you said also, and I was gonna get to that you have to bring up what else is on the market.
Right.
I think one of the important conversations to have with sellers about value of their apartment is, number one, if somebody bought something about 10 years ago in the last high, and they didn't renovate it since then, so they bought it new in the last high, and they didn't renovate it, and they just lived in it for 10 to 11 years, their apartment's not worth any more than when they bought it. In fact, it's probably worth less. So that's just a data point that people should know, and I've now figured that out several times. Partially, that has to do with the fact that they've used it and it's not new anymore, and after 10 years, everybody thinks you have to redo bathrooms and kitchens. Partially, the market in 2006, 7, 8, there was a lot less inventory. So what I'm noticing now is if you paid a lot for something pretty special in 6, 7, or 8, yours was that was the only game in town, and you probably overpaid and bought in a bidding war. And now, whatever you're selling, there's a lot of that available. So that is super important, is to show how much competition there is, and the competition tends to be new.
Well, speaking of new, Charlie, Brooklyn's been a development bonanza lately. Does that come in to Lisa's point? If you're selling something in older, look, there's a new building going up a couple blocks, because Park Slope has even seen a lot of development. It hasn't just been Williamsburg and Greenpoint.
Right, well, there's a dichotomy still, so if you bought in Brooklyn 10 years ago, you're still up tremendously. What we've had pockets of, we still have now don't have inventory. I mean, I received 2 emails this weekend from a Compass broker and Element broker about, oh, Charlie, you've sold a lot in this building. My client wants a 3-bedroom in this pre-war building. And I'm like, well, we're trying to do a deal now with something not coming on the market, off market. And there's 5 other people that want that. So it's still a dichotomy, yeah. So the areas I would stay away from. And look, you know what you're good at, you know what you're not good at. I'll tell you what I'm not good at. I'm not good at new construction, Williamsburg, I don't know. I'll give it to somebody else, or I'll help somebody along, but that side of the market, I don't know. So, but basically, inventory is high. So Clinton Hill, Bed-Stuy, Bushwick, all I'll say the second tier, or Bed-Stuy, Lehman collapsed, houses were trending around $1 million in Bed-Stuy. Now you're buying stuff for up to $2 million, or even maybe low 2s for something that's done, crazy. The stuff that was trading for $1 million right before Lehman collapsed, after it collapsed, they were trading for $600,000. Huge price differential, huge reduction in prices. But we don't have, yes, certain inventory, I would say, houses that need a ton of work, townhouses, they need a ton of work. Buyers don't have the money. A lot of the buyers are not all cash buyers anymore, and they can't get the loan, and they want rental income, and then they might be selling something in Manhattan, now they realize they can't sell. That's a big problem we're gonna have, is people in Manhattan who wanna come to Brooklyn now realize that they can't sell their Manhattan place for what they want. It's gonna take them a lot longer. Okay, well, let's not even start looking in Brooklyn until we're sort of further along on this. I think that's the one major thing that we're gonna start seeing more of.
And you agree, Terry, you're seeing that in your head.
About what he said?
Yeah, new development too, it's what drives the articles in the paper. You talk about these unsold units. We just said, Lisa said about 2008, there might have been actually more apartments for sale, but there were a lot more buyers, right? So the absorption rate we were used to absorption rates of 3-4 months supply of apartments. And that's why, again, I think that's the best report we produce, because that's really what's happening now and the future. But do you advise your seller, like, look, there's 2 new buildings going up here, or, this is not the time to get picky. I know you bought it, if they bought in recently new. Because I think that's where buyers have the best bargains, I think, in the market now, is stuff that you can get it cheaper, much cheaper than 3-4 years ago.
The new development.
Yeah, recent developments that,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I do want to say, I sell in both Manhattan and Brooklyn.
Right.
Not everywhere in Manhattan, not everywhere in Brooklyn. But what Charlie was saying is correct. Brooklyn is doing a lot better. So the 10-year mark that Lisa was talking about, where if you bought 10 years ago and you didn't do anything to it, doesn't matter.
Right.
You might even be double what you paid for it 10 years ago. So there are a few things at play. The Brooklyn market and the Manhattan market are different, and Brooklyn always lags Manhattan. Last time the height of the market was March of 2007 in Manhattan, but in Brooklyn it was July of 2008, which is very different. Now the lag was even longer, which I thought it wouldn't be, because a lot of people are looking, buyers are not specific about location or even borough. They're looking in the Upper East Side, and they're looking in Park Slope, and they might even be looking at Queens, and they might be looking in Connecticut somewhere. So they're looking all over the place. So I would expect it to have shrunk, but it didn't. The lag period didn't shrink, it actually expanded. When you're looking at a place with your seller, and the seller has a condo that say they bought 10 years ago, and there are other buildings going up around there, in Brooklyn, those new apartments are selling at much higher prices, but this person who's selling theirs and they bought it 10 years ago, they've still increased in value, but even at that, with that profit, with that increase, they're still at a lower price per square foot than that new development. So it's not
Do
really,
they know that? Because that's a complaint we hear in Manhattan all the time.
that's really not as relevant. So one of the things that we all hear all the time is, well, that apartment over there is selling for $5 million. And you're like, which apartment? Okay, this apartment is selling for $5 million. Well, it's not even a contract, it's asking $5 million, it's not selling. It's just sitting there, it's not selling for $5 million. So we don't know if that means nothing. You could put any price on a property and stick it up there. It's irrelevant, it means nothing. So when people say, and it depends on the size of the building and the neighborhood and everything, but when people say, oh, well, that building right across the street is selling or has sold at this price, I say, you know what, in this building, or for example where I live in Brooklyn, our building, it's just about our building. There are no comps outside the building. This is about this building. You have high ceilings, you have a lot of space, it's value, but you don't have views. You're not gonna get views. Those people are looking at the harbor. They might be across the street from you, but they have incredible views. Brand new, nobody's lived there. You can't compare this, apples and oranges.
Right.
So immediately I removed that off of the table. It shouldn't be on the table.
The problem is, what do you do if there's not enough activity in the building? You've got to look outside.
If there's not enough activity in the building, well, if it's irrelevant, it's irrelevant.
Okay.
So you can look historically and see what's happened and look what's happening right now that properties are on the market. And the other thing too is, in Manhattan there are huge buildings. In a lot of the neighborhoods in Brooklyn, they're small buildings, so they're more boutique, fewer units to sell, and I think that's part of why they're selling more quickly. And yes, you can buy a place right now that was selling 3 years ago at a discount, but it's still not cheap. And it's not 30% less.
Right.
It's still not cheap.
Yeah, Brooklyn, as Manhattan kind of led the way out of the recession, and we always say Manhattan behaves differently. Brooklyn's sort of mirroring what's going on nationally right now. The absorption rates in Brooklyn Heights were probably under 1.5 months at the height of it, because there was nothing to sell. So nationally, you're seeing this run up in prices right now, which is leading to fewer sales, not because of tax reform or rates so much as there's very little product to sell because not enough got built, and the prices have just got jacked up way too high. Even though it's, these areas, you're talking about $250,000, it's hard for us to understand. But Neil, going to that, so there's two, objective reasons why buyers want lower prices right now. One, the rates are up, even though they're half of what they historically have been, and 2% more than they were when we had a housing bubble, but they're higher than they were a year ago. And we have tax reform, which I don't know when the day of reckoning when that comes. I got that a little wrong. I thought it would have happened by now. So is this something you suggest brokers, remind their sellers of? Everybody knows about this stuff, but maybe are they missing that this is on every buyer's mind?
I don't know that they're missing it, but I don't know that rates have actually backed off a little bit.
They're still-
after a good run up, and rates are.
You can also look those up in economic
That's
outlets.
right, that's right. In 2007, rates were probably in the 6 5/8 range on a 30-year mortgage. So that was the last peak. Is it, less expensive today to borrow money? It is. So sellers see that if they're tracking and they're finance minded, and they, it's a hard argument to say that it's more expensive for buyers today. I don't think that the impact in Manhattan, we have a very specific market, will be as severe on prices with respect to the tax reform, because every time I turn around, somebody's telling me that wealthy people actually benefit from the changes, right? You were facing alternative minimum tax anyway, so you didn't benefit from the state tax deduction. So we'll see. I know that buyers psychologically think they can wait and the market will be softer. So the one thing I would say to sellers in these conversations is, can you point to a catalyst for us that would change the trajectory of the market? Identify 1 or 2 variables fundamentally that you see in the next 2 months, 6 months, 12 months that would point to prices turning and increasing. And we're really absent any positive variable. You can also look at building permits on that important
You
web
can
link.
compare by borough.
Could you use that as a leading indicator to say, well, building permits are down, inventory is going to be down in 2 to 4 years. That's the time when we'll see that inflection, or we'll see a bottom. I was on the phone with Michael Vargas the other day, and I asked him specifically, can you identify for anybody a catalyst right now for this market to turn and prices to begin appreciating? And he couldn't identify anything specifically. He estimated 2 to 3 months of additional softness, but without specifying, what factor would change that direction of prices. So yeah, those conversations, they're not as meaningful to sellers as they don't carry as much weight as you might think, and the buyers are hoping it carries a lot more weight than it really does.
Well, I think that buyers, if I'm a buyer, I'm using every argument that I can possibly make. There's another looming thing, I can say a second, that we have to keep in mind as an economist. I'm always thinking about this. This is the second longest economic expansion in American history. Next year, it will become the longest. Now, it's one of the weakest in terms of how fast we've been growing. So that's why it can be longer. But I think that's also on buyers' minds too, that, we've been on this incredible run since bottoming out in 08 economically anyway, not housing-wise. But Danielle, you had a point.
Before we go to Daniela for 1 second, I do want to say, you asked about the fundamentals, you asked about interest rates, and I think the thing that's is critical to impress upon sellers when we talk about this expansion, and we talk about, or they talk to us about the economy being so robust, yet I can't achieve the price point that I want. Wage growth hasn't kept up with asset appreciation. There's an incredible diversion between wage growth and the price of Manhattan apartments. And I mentioned 2006, 2007, as far as interest rates go, we are now just returning to median household incomes in Manhattan to the levels that we were at in 2006, 2007. So the purchasing power for the buy side, even if they want to buy your apartment, is not where it was relative to prices back then.
Tell that to the Wall Street people that now make $450,000.
But those people, you don't have the depth of earnings, up and down the chain of the Morgan Stanley employee from executive director to managing director. You've got the guys at the top if their department did well, or the women, but you don't have that follow through.
All right, Daniela, if you still remember what you were.
I do actually, miraculously.
And then we're going to go to Q&A.
So what I wanted to chime in on what Neil was saying is I could be wrong, but I do actually, I don't see any indicator of prices going up, but I do expect that absorption rates will go down as new sellers hit the market. And I tell my sellers that, and what's useful about that as well, and it is my genuine opinion, you know, as our older sellers that have been in the market when, you know, for 488 days, which I think was Don Olson's most recent days on market for a contract signing, it's like a crazy amount of time. They are still stubborn, but the new sellers that are accustomed to hearing the messaging of where the market is, I think will come in more realistically, and I think their properties will sell because they will be meeting the market. There is a pent-up buyer pool. That it's not that there aren't buyers for all this excess inventory, they're just not willing to buy it at current pricing. But I do think things will start moving when new sellers hit the market and they're more realistic. And I find that a soothing somehow our, you know, conversation to have, and it also helps unstick the stuck sellers, because basically, I mean, what I'm suggesting with that is you will stay stuck, you will get sold out, one will sell out from under you when people hit the market where it really is. So
Well,
it's
that's
not.
the key thing. You know, Lehman Brothers was a crisis of demand.
Mhm.
People were afraid of their jobs, were afraid of this horrible recession that was going to come, and it was rip the Band-Aid off 6 months of hell. The frustrating part now is people do want to buy. The prices are, and once they do get where they need to, I agree, absorption rates will be cut very rapidly.
One really quick thing?
Yes, go ahead.
Before you take a property, I would suggest you go to Acris, figure out what they owe on it. Figure out what they owe on it, see if they have a home equity line of credit. The next thing, I think the next shoe to drop is some of these people are having resets on their home equity lines of credit, and it's starting to hurt them. So just FYI, when you go, before you take something and somebody's a little too frantic about what they want, try to figure out, okay, what do they owe on it? Just have some more education.
Just-
Go to Acris and figure it out.
Right, just to be clear, that only works with condos and townhouses.
Right.
It's
But-
co-ops, amounts are on, and you don't get an updated balance, but it is a great idea. You know, you can also pull their property tax bills. All these links are in my VHS under the important links section. No, we're going to Q&A.
Oh, we are going to Q&A.
Yes. I was told to make sure we have Q&A. I'll let Sarah pick this way, nobody's mad.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your comments. I've been in the business 37 years. I find it's probably the toughest year I've ever seen, and I think the market is changing. The buyers are changing, and I would like to have your quick comments. Of course, the millennials have huge student debts, so they don't buy, they rent. People are used to go direct. At my open houses, I see very few brokers. People come directly. I mean, there's some trends like that. Could you briefly comment on what you're seeing? Our market is really changing, our business is changing, in my opinion.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So if you're coming to list my apartment, I'm going to ask you, who do you think's going to buy it? Terry, what are you going to tell me?
I have to be honest, when I first started in the business, I used to say, well, clearly, this is a townhouse, so it's for a growing family. They're moving out of their 3-bedroom. They're moving into your place. And after a number of years, I realized I can't tell who's gonna buy their apartment or who's gonna buy the property, because it's not like that. A single person goes and buys that townhouse. Why? I don't know. So if someone says, who's gonna buy my apartment, like, what's the demographic? Who are these
Right,
people?
who are we marketing to, all that stuff, yeah.
Yeah, well, we're gonna target it to the people we know are moving to this area, right? And target it to the brokers who've done the most business in that area, and that we can do.
Right.
But in terms of who's gonna buy their property, I just tell them honestly that I used to do that and say, this kind of person is most likely gonna buy yours, but in New York, you never know.
Now it's just somebody with that much money.
Yeah, whoever-
Lisa, is the mix changing?
Well, I mean, I think to specifically answer Danielle's question, I think, and one thing we didn't talk about at all, and it is a big factor in our market, is that buyers feel much more educated than they ever did, and they feel very empowered with all of the data. Everything is completely clear. You know, as brokers, we used to hold information about close prices and a lot of other things that, you know, now is all public information. You know, Street Easy, all of the different websites, they have completely changed the equation. And, you know, in many ways, it's great, right? Knowledge is power, but in many ways, it's really hurt things, because sometimes buyers think that they know more than they do know, because we all know that the photos that we post and the description that's posted online that becomes data is as good as the person who input it or anything else. So, you know, the market has really changed, and that goes back to my feeling about you have to take each situation differently, and it's an organic process. You need to know how to respond to every situation. So yes, we get a lot more direct buyers. I personally find them very difficult because they think they know so much, they think they're gonna cut a better deal by you not having to split your commission. And you have to be very conscious of sort of making it clear that you represent the seller, that the information that you're giving is information just purely informational. And you also have to make sure that you know everything about your property and all the comps, the sold comps, the other things that are on the market. I mean, as brokers, we need to know a lot more. It used to be a lot easier. I mean, you know, now I know when I'm selling something, I need to know what's sold in the building, what's sold in the neighborhood, what else is on the market, and I really need to know what those other things look like so that you can combat anything that somebody says. I mean, I have a listing right now where it's on the 10th floor and I'm trying to get a bidder and their broker up, and the 12th floor apartment sold a couple of years ago, and the broker said to me, well, that cleared the building next door. Now, if I hadn't seen that apartment, I would have probably been like, ooh, she's right, you know, like, we deserve a lot less. But because I had seen it and I knew it, I was able to say, yes, you cleared, but you didn't really clear it. You got a little more sky, but you didn't actually clear the building next door. So I think, you know, times are changing. You have to keep up with the changes. You need to know more. You need to study more. And you know, I guess the silver lining of that is it keeps it interesting, and it keeps you on your toes.
It keeps me employed too.
I'll just use the phrase attraction to get the right reaction, okay? Attraction to the web text, the photos, does it need to be staged? So the idea is when you list that property, you want the most eyeballs on it as possible. So that's the phrase I would use.
Makes sense. Next question. Chris, you can't ask a question.
I'm supposed to ask.
Oh, okay, Chris asked a question. I must have missed that one.
Speaking of bad news, you've now had to explain to this seller that they're probably not going to be able to achieve the price they wanted. How do you then follow up and explain to them that you're not lowering your commission?
That's a good question. Daniela, you want to tackle that?
All right. I'm somewhat committed to not considering my commission as part of the negotiation or as you know, locked in with the value of the property. I try to keep them distinct. I believe that they are distinct. I don't believe that that the percentage of whatever we obtain for their property fluctuates with the, you know, with the, I wouldn't even say value of the property, because the value is what the value is, which is also part of my conversation. This is not, you know, it's not that I'm underselling you and as a result I should be chipping, you know, in for that. It's that this is where the value is, and we've agreed to a commission structure. And I don't have it in that harsh way ever, and it doesn't really ever get there. Now, I will say, are there times where I feel that I am being, that whatever I've arranged with a seller is so favorable to me, and that happens. You know, sometimes they'll sign 6% on a $5 million and never even ask for anything off on a direct. That when things go off of their asking price and their dream, that I volunteer, and because it's been so great, you know, so I'll say, you know, in order, in theory, we could have, you know, I'm handling this directly, I can kick this in, you know, my company can kick this in or whatever. But I will say also that when I feel that I have been squeezed initially, I'm not at all that open to that. When I've already done my share in advance in the negotiation on the exclusive, I don't typically. I mean, if something needs absolutely at the end, at the final hour, even in that circumstance, to get chipped in, to get the thing done and off my desk, okay. But it's not, it's a different, I have different positions on it.
So Neil, how do you advise a broker? I mean, you're working harder, the harder the deal is.
Yeah.
I can imagine that's why, as a broker, I'm like, why should I take less?
Right.
I'm gonna get less anyway.
But
for
you're
lower
getting
price.
less.
Right, that's the thing,
Yeah.
but they don't view it, I'm assuming they don't view it, but Neil, what do you tell a broker?
I think this is my answer as a preview for the next forum, which is turning easy conversations into positive results because of all these things you said. If I were out there right now, I honestly would be charging 6% across the board, and I might even ask for 7% in some cases. Because you're working a lot harder, days on market are twice what they were when people were getting 6% at all times. And you're more important now than you ever have been as an agent. And Lisa talked about data being available and buyers being knowledgeable. But what drives deals today, successful deals, is not the data input and output. It's not specifically the pricing. It's when you get into that pricing range and you have an interested buyer, and we talked about the lack of buyer depth, you know you have one chance at it, and the seller is emotional, and the seller is stressed, and that's your client. How do you keep those two people moving closer and closer to a deal during this process? And that requires enormous emotional intelligence. It requires enormous patience. It requires expertise. It requires commitment. All the things that you should be charging more for, because you can't replicate that profile in every broker out there. And there are 13,600 agents or something in Manhattan alone. To find somebody who can handle those egos, who can handle that emotion, who can handle the financial side of it, it's a rare combination, and brokers today should be a lot more, I would say, stout about their commissions, especially after the fact.
Why don't we take a question from this side of the room? We haven't hit this side yet. Anybody?
And while we're moving to the back, Greg, I just want to plug Greg's analytics and touch on when buildings haven't had a number of units sell recently, or you have very few sales to comp.
Right.
You can use analytics and say, where was the market at the time this person bought, and what's the overall market trend?
Just be careful, because I get a lot of calls and emails saying, if an apartment sold in June of 2012, what's it worth today? That is not the opportune way to price an apartment now, but it is a good reminder for somebody like, hey, you're getting a nice return on this. You know, you're having capital gains. If they have capital gains, they still have their exclusion. Tax reform hadn't touched that. But maybe the best enhancement in the economic data is great for Lisa, but the fact that you have results analytics now, because people looked at analytics and said, I don't want the Upper West Side. I only want between this and this, and I want this grid. Well, you can do that now. Do your search, get your results, hit the analytics icon, make some charts, send them to your client. Say exactly what you think they need to say. You don't have to explain, well, 15 Central Park West is throwing off these numbers. You get to pick every sale that goes into those charts. So I can't suggest strongly enough that you become familiar. But we had a question back there?
Yeah, somewhat of a question, somewhat of a comment. Our conversation today is a lot about the sellers, maybe a little less about the buyers. And where I'm finding it maybe more difficult is I think a lot of people accept that the price has peaked at a certain point. They do see that the economy is positive, but where I'm having the hardest conversations is actually with the buyers who I believe are out there, but many of them are sitting on the sidelines with the belief that there is something yet to come. There's something maybe worse down the road, and they're sort of waiting for that moment.
Right.
And now the sellers are starting to inch their way down, but the buyers haven't quite inched their way up. I'm of course telling them that I think this is the best opportunity because in this period of stagnation, there's the least knowledge, and that's where the opportunity is greatest. But a lot of them are sort of staying pretty firm on the sidelines in the belief that there's something worse, and that's where I'm finding the conversations difficult.
Right, and I think buyers had a great opportunity, and I know I harped on this a lot, right when tax reform was passed, to take advantage of some sellers who were nervous. And also, this is the third straight year of a second half event. Go back a couple years ago, Brexit, you have an election. Go back to the second half of last year, the whole concept of tax reform and what it might mean. Now, Lisa may not have heard, but we have a midterm election coming, which could, not just change the makeup of who controls the House, but could get a president impeached, could lead to a lot of bad feelings, if there aren't already enough of those going around, could lead to stock market volatility. To me, the key is showing the buyer you're getting it significantly cheaper than in some cases, the person bought it for. But Lisa, we'll start with you, since I've already said you like twice in this last sentence. What do you tell your buyer who, because you can't look him or her in the eye and say it won't be cheaper 6 months from now, because we don't know that. And honestly, it's more likely that it will be cheaper than more expensive. So how do you have that conversation with the buyer?
You know, what I really will say to a buyer is I think you should be looking all the time, because when it's the cheapest, when you think it's now become the cheapest it will be, you've already missed it, because that's when it starts going back up again, right? So nobody knows where the bottom is. I mean, my sense is that we don't have that much further to go down. You know, one thing that we didn't talk about was, you know, in tax reform and the change in the SALT deductions. I think people are nervous about that, and by next spring, they're gonna kind of figure out what that looks like different in their tax bill. People are nervous about the midterm elections. People are nervous about the presidency. A lot of that has already been baked into our market. I really do think a lot of it has been baked in. So I don't know how much more downturn we have. And again, what I would say to a buyer is, by the time you realize we've bottomed out, you're starting to go back up, and that means now you're gonna chase other buyers buying things as this prices go back up. So I tell my buyers to keep looking. Look, let's look. I always make sure they know I'm not pushing them, that I'm patient. You should always tell buyers that you're patient and that you'll be there with them. If you think they're real buyers. By the way, we've all had buyers who look for 10 years and they've seen the market go up and down and they've lost it every time. So, but if you think somebody's real, just have them look, and I would tell them when they see something that seems valuable to them, which means the price seems right and they like it enough, they should strike, because it's a good market and we can never be sure where the bottom is. And long term, New York City real estate is valuable. It's a small island. We can't build more than a certain amount. People always want to live here. We saw that after 9/11. Everybody thought nobody would ever live in New York again. And the spring after 9/11, we had a crazy, amazing market. So I think you have to try to pull them out of this like next 6 month thing and make them look at, you know, big picture, and the fact that eventually it will be high again or will be higher again.
There's an old expression, I think it's Warren Buffett, says about Wall Street, it's the only place that when there's a sale, nobody wants to buy. And I always think, one of the suggestions I make to brokers is, there are tens of thousands of people that get paid a lot of money to do technical analysis of stock prices. And there are thousands of data points that you can look at. Economic data, you know, same store sales for a retail company, high and low prices, you have 100 years worth of data, and people can't time the stock market. So our market that does not move that quickly, does not have that many data points, you know, at any given time only has between 6,000 and 7,000 apartments for sale. How are you going to time that? So Charlie, why don't people want to buy when the price is going down? They only seem to want to buy when the price is going up.
Well, the other thing we haven't talked about, and it's more.
You guys are getting in trouble saying we haven't talked about
Is the tariffs and a little bit of wage inflation. I mean, if you're a heavily financed buyer and you're putting only 20% down, and you really don't want to worry about rates, like, you know, short term, like, I think if we hit on the short term, 5.25, 30-year fixed, there's going to be some more pullback. But the question is, you're financing 80%. Do you really want to risk a rate that's going to get to maybe this? Maybe you do want to lock in. Or if, you know, some people are really wealthy and they'll come to you and say, look, I want to be situated. I want what I want. I want to know that I'm not overpaying for the current market. So you show me what's trending, what's selling, and then I'll make the decision. But you know they're well off. You know they want to be situated. Maybe may want to get out of Manhattan because they don't want to spend $20 million or can't spend $20 million for a townhouse. But you find them something for $5 or $6 million. But I think the one thing is the heavily financed buyer. You really don't know where the bottom is going to be. Maybe you just want to lock it in so you're not paying a 5, 6, 7% rate.
And you find that, I mean, Terry, when you talk to someone, do you mention too that, yes, there's a lot of product out there, but how much of it is right for you? Or, you know, are you going to, because I always say, you know, what's going to upset you more? If you wait and rates go up, or if you buy now and maybe the price goes down a little bit. You can always refinance, right? You can't rebuy your house.
Right.
So what do you think, you know, every broker should be reminding their buyers of?
Well, just like with sellers, how I ask about what their goals are, with buyers I ask them the same question. What are your goals? And I don't give them ideas, and I let them speak. So they might start talking about a romantic place where they wanna live and they wanna grow their family or, you know, whatever. Or they might say, I wanna get in on the market. I know that it goes up and I want this, you know, investment value. My next question always is, how long do you see yourself being there? If they say 2 or 3 years, I tell them not to buy. I don't care what the market is, 2 or 3 years, I don't think it makes any sense. The transaction costs of going in, coming out, the hassle of it, not worth it. So then when we determine what they're looking at and what they wanna do, I tell them this is the best time, because honestly, it's the best time. It's like being in a candy store and you wanna buy candy. And there's everything. People who only wanted an apartment can now maybe buy a house. And that wasn't possible before, because the houses are so cheap comparatively. And you get so much more, and you get your hand in the dirt, as my friend Frank says, as opposed to being, you know, a little apartment in the sky somewhere. I do find that with buyers, they do listen to what you say, because they've come to you because you're the expert. You're the one there to tell them what is going on, what you would do in that situation. And I often do that. I often tell people, now's the time to buy, if it's really the time to buy. I say, and right now is the time to buy. In 2009, I really regretted not buying anything. Of course, I couldn't afford to buy anything because the market was down so much, but it was killing me then. And right now, I've talked to my husband, I'm like, we have to think about where we're going after our kids are like out, and we need to buy it now. Because now is the absolute best time. There's so much on the market. I know that makes the buyer have more choice, and it'll take them longer to basically see what's out there before they make that decision. But when you go out with them, it's no longer that situation where, do you remember the times when you had a buyer and then a property would pop up, like once every 3 weeks, and you were like, we need to go see this now. When can you get out? Let's do it. That's no longer the case. There's so much. But I do think the buyers do need us as brokers more than ever, because guess what? They think they know what's going on. They don't know what's going on. They look at the pictures, they look at the floor plan, they don't know that the buildings across the street are not showing. They're right up. They don't know what's happening right underneath. They don't know that a jail opened up next door. Like, they don't know any of that stuff. We do, because we go and we look at all the properties. Recently I had a buyer come to me and say that his friend told him that he should use a broker, and I came recommended from a friend of hers, and I don't even know who. And he goes, I have to tell you, I really don't feel like I need a broker, because I see everything, I know everything, I know what's what, I already know what I wanna buy, like, why do I need you? And I was like, oh my God, he's asking me why he needs me. So then I said, well, what do you do in your profession? Oh, I'm a scientist. Okay, so what do you do? So then he started telling me what he does. And I'm like, well, I guess I could do the same thing that you do. Like, why is it that you do this thing and you get paid for it and it's your profession? This is my profession. I'm looking at property day in and day out. I'm constantly going to construction sites. I'm looking at what's selling, what's not selling, what else came on the market, what happened with this thing that was on the market 3 years ago and traded and then came on the market again and sold again for a lower price or a higher price or whatever. So I do this day in and day out, and I'm not gonna find you a property. You're probably looking online at your specific criteria more than I am, but once you find that property, I'm here to tell you, this is what I think it's worth. This is what you need to do. This is the strategy of making the offer. This is when you make it. This is, how you should do it. I look and say, how much of your money do you have for real estate? Don't put all your eggs in one basket. It's more involved than just, oh, okay, here are the listings, buy one of them. It's not that simple.
There's been this movement now for 20 years to get rid of the real estate broker in this whole process. Usually it's been more on the selling side. But it's funny, we had a meeting Tuesday, and Hall said something that goes exactly to what you said, talking about a tough market like this. Hall's trying to think of what it was now, but I know he knows. He said brokers have to get out there. That's what you said. You've got to see the product, touch the product, know the product. And there's more of it for you to know, and that's a good thing if you approach it the right way. And just to go to Terry's comment about wishing you bought in 09, if you have someone that thinks they can time the market because they're an economist or a scientist or a Wall Streeter, ask them how much stock they bought at the beginning of 2009. If they think they know when things have bottomed out. But we have to stop now. It's 11:02. By the big clock there. This is really cool to have a clock. I want to thank Daniela, Charlie. I want to thank Terry, Lisa, and Neil. I didn't put you last. Neil last. I want to thank Frank, and maybe he wants to come up and say a couple words, or Paul first, then Frank.
No, I just want to thank all the panelists. You're so generous. You are such success stories and talented people, and you're very generous to share. And I think that helps all of us. And that's something I don't think we do enough in this industry, is you get what you give. So give to each other, give knowledge, and you will receive back. And you're an example of that. Thank you very much.
So thank you once again. Thank you to our panelists. You know, it was very valuable for me to listen to the conversation and to your questions and just more insight into your business. Because the way that I look at my business, and it's, you know, we're on the same side of the table, just different parts of the conversation. I look at my business to deliver value to the transaction, right? How do I use financing to deliver value to the transaction? What I look at, my philosophy is research, review, recommend, and by doing that, I get the client on board. I help them get comfortable with the decision making, and a lot of that's data and empathetic listening, and I think that's what I heard a lot of here. And two other comments I heard that I just wanted to touch on, because one thing in finance and markets that's I've always remembered since I first read it in a book is that you never know what ship is on the horizon, but there are other ships right beyond that horizon, right? It might be a push in demand, it might be a pullback in price, but you know, two comments that I picked up on that I just want to kind of reiterate is, number one, wage inflation. If wage inflation picks up and it helps with purchasing power, because wage inflation, unemployment's at all-time lows, but wage inflation is just starting to tick up slightly. If that picks up, that's gonna help people's purchasing power, which will be able to help what they're willing to bid on a price, right? So that's a ship right beyond the horizon that's gonna help with demand. The second one is a comment that Lisa made from 10 years ago, a house that was bought till today. It's amazing, real estate is the only asset that you can buy that you expect that you use every single day, that you constantly expect it to get higher and higher and higher, and you most likely used it with other people's money. It's just an amazing thing if you got a mortgage. And it's an amazing mindset that you have to have these conversations with people in a way that you can kind of level down and speak with them. And you know, that's kind of been a key to my success in the business, is just be able to have these data points and have a philosophy. And it was just really nice to hear everyone speak, and thank you for coming out this morning, and hopefully we can do this again. And I expect to see bamboo plants everywhere around here.